Einstein kept a portrait of Schopenhauer on his study wall, the only non-scientist he displayed there. Not Beethoven, not Goethe, a philosopher who argued that free will is an illusion. Einstein said it brought him peace. When people did cruel or thoughtless things, he didn't have to hate them for it. They couldn't have done otherwise. It's a strange kind of comfort, the idea that everything, every decision, every hesitation, every late-night regret was already set in motion long before you arrived. Tonight we're sitting with that idea for a while. Determinism, free will, and the quiet question of what it actually changes if the answer turns out to be nothing. There's a moment, and it's a small one, easy to miss, where you decide to move your hand. Maybe you're reaching for a glass of water, or scratching your nose, or just flexing your fingers for no particular reason. You feel it happen, that little spark of "I'll do that now." It feels like yours. It feels like the beginning of something. But in 1983, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet discovered something that quietly unsettled the entire conversation about what it means to choose. Libet was working with a simple setup. He asked people to sit in front of a clock, a special one, with a dot sweeping around its face, and to flick their wrist whenever they felt like it, whenever the urge struck. And while they did this, he measured the electrical activity in their brains, specifically in the motor cortex, the part responsible for planning and executing movement. What he found was this: there was a buildup of electrical activity, something called the readiness potential, that began roughly 550 milliseconds before the person actually moved their hand. More than half a second. That on its own wasn't especially surprising. Brains prepare movements, that's what they do. The strange part was the timing. When Libet asked people to note the position of the dot on the clock at the exact moment they felt the urge to move, the moment they consciously experienced the decision, that feeling showed up about 200 milliseconds before the action. Which means the brain had already been preparing the movement for over a third of a second before the person felt like they'd decided anything at all. Let that settle for a moment. The conscious experience of choosing, that feeling of now, arrived late. The brain was already in motion, already committed in some electrochemical sense to the flick of the wrist. And then, a few hundred milliseconds later, consciousness showed up and said, "I meant to do that." It's a little like arriving at a train station and finding the train already moving, already pulling away from the platform, and somehow convincing yourself that you were the one who set it going. Libet himself wasn't entirely comfortable with what his experiment seemed to imply. He spent years afterward trying to carve out a role for conscious will, a kind of veto power, a last-ditch ability to stop the movement even if you didn't start it. And maybe that's true. Maybe consciousness is less the driver and more the emergency brake, but the central finding remained, and it didn't go away. Other researchers repeated it, refined it, and eventually someone pushed it much further. In 2008, a neuroscientist named John Dylan Haynes, working at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, decided to look deeper. Haynes wasn't using electrodes on the scalp the way Libet had. He was using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which let him watch patterns of activity across the whole brain, not just the motor cortex. He asked people to do something simple: press one of two buttons, left or right, whenever they felt like it. And while they lay inside the scanner, making their choices, Haynes and his team watched the blood flow shift through their brains. What they found pushed the timeline back dramatically. Activity patterns in the frontopolar cortex, a region near the front of the brain involved in planning and abstract thought, could predict which button a person would press up to 7 seconds before the person consciously felt they had made a choice. 7 seconds, and with weaker, fuzzier signals, hints of the decision appeared up to 10 seconds beforehand. Think about what that means for a moment. You're lying in a scanner. You feel as though you're freely choosing right now in this instant to press the left button. But your brain, some deep, unconscious part of it, settled on left 7 seconds ago. Maybe longer. What you're experiencing as the moment of decision may not be a decision at all. It may be something more like a notification. the conscious mind receiving a memo from a process that was already well underway. It's not that consciousness is irrelevant exactly. It's more that its role might be different from what we've always assumed, less the author of the story and more the narrator arriving after the events, stitching them together, claiming credit in retrospect. And this is where it gets personal, not in the lab coat brain scanner sense, but in the quiet, sitting alone at night sense. Sam Harris, who trained as a neuroscientist before becoming a philosopher and writer, has pointed out that you don't actually need an fMRI machine to notice this. You don't need electrodes or a sweeping dot clock. You just need a few seconds of honest attention. Try it, or rather just think about trying it, since you might be lying down, maybe close to sleep. Think about sitting quietly and waiting for your next thought to arrive, not generating a thought, not choosing one, just watching the empty space where a thought is about to appear. What happens? A thought shows up. Maybe it's about tomorrow, maybe it's about something someone said to you earlier, maybe it's just a word or an image or a fragment of a song you haven't heard in years. It just appears from somewhere you can't point to, out of some darkness you don't have access to. And then after it's already there, you feel a sense of ownership. I thought that was my idea. But were you the one who summoned it? Did you choose that particular thought from a menu of options? Or did it simply arrive the way a sound arrives, the way a breeze arrives, and you claimed authorship only after the fact? Harris calls this the simplest possible meditation on determinism. No equipment necessary, no philosophy degree, just a few seconds of paying attention to the gap between a thought arising and the feeling that you produced it. And once you see that gap, once you really notice it, it's hard to unsee. It doesn't feel dramatic, that's the thing. It doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels more like noticing that the ventriloquist's lips are moving, like realizing that the voice you thought was coming from the puppet has been coming from somewhere else the whole time, and the puppet, that's you, or at least it's the part of you that's been taking credit. There's something strangely peaceful about it, actually. Not immediately. The first brush with the idea can feel vertiginous, disorienting, like the floor tilting slightly beneath you. But if you stay with it, if you let the thought just sit there without fighting it, something softens. Because if your thoughts arise on their own, if even the feeling of choosing is something that happens to you rather than something you do, then maybe the weight of all those choices, all those moments where you agonized and second-guessed and blamed yourself for picking wrong, maybe that weight isn't entirely yours to carry. But that's a thread to follow later. For now, just the observation, just the quiet, slightly unsettling fact that your brain was already reaching for the glass before you decided to pick it up. So your brain has its own timetable. That much seems clear from the experiments, but maybe that's just a quirk of neurology, a glitch in the wiring between intention and awareness. Maybe the universe itself still leaves room for genuine choice, even if our brains are a little ahead of schedule. It's a comforting thought, and it's one that philosophers and physicists have been chasing for a very long time. Let's go back, way back, to 1814, and a French mathematician named Pierre-Simon Laplace. Laplace was not a mystic. He was not trying to be provocative. He was simply following Newtonian physics to its logical conclusion, and what he arrived at was this: if some vast intellect could know the exact position and momentum of every single atom in the universe at one precise moment, every particle of dust, every molecule of air, every electron spinning around every nucleus, then that intellect could, in principle, calculate the entire future. Every raindrop that would ever fall, every word that would ever be spoken, every war, every kiss, every Tuesday afternoon, all of it unspooling from that single snapshot like a film reel that had already been developed. And not just the future, the past, too. Every event that had ever occurred, reconstructed perfectly from that one frozen instant. Laplace himself put this quite calmly. It was a mathematical observation, almost a footnote. He never even called this hypothetical intellect a demon. That word came later, added by other writers who recognized something haunting in what Laplace had so matter-of-factly described. And maybe they were right to give it that name, because there is something unsettling about the idea, not because it requires anything supernatural, but precisely because it doesn't. It's just physics, just math. Just the claim that if you knew enough, prediction would be total. The demon doesn't need to interfere with anything. It doesn't need to pull strings or manipulate outcomes. It just watches, and it already knows. Think of it this way: you've probably seen one of those massive domino setups, thousands of pieces arranged in elaborate patterns, and someone tips the first one and the whole thing cascades. Every fall is determined by the fall before it. If you knew the exact weight, angle, and spacing of every domino, you wouldn't need to watch. You could calculate the entire sequence from the first tap. Laplace was saying that the universe might be like that, not dominoes, obviously, but particles, fields, forces. All following laws that don't bend, don't hesitate, don't leave room for anything to go differently than it was always going to go. And if that's true, if the universe really is one unbroken chain of cause and effect stretching back to the first moment of existence, then every thought you've ever had, every decision you've ever agonized over, was already implicit in the arrangement of matter 13 billion years ago. You were always going to be lying here, listening to this, at exactly this moment. Which is, admittedly, a lot to sit with. Now, people have been trying to escape that chain for even longer than Laplace has been tightening it. About 21 centuries longer, actually. Around 300 BCE, the Greek philosopher Epicurus looked at the deterministic universe his predecessor Democritus had described, a cosmos made entirely of atoms falling through void in straight lines, every collision predetermined, every outcome locked in, and he said, essentially, no. Not because he had evidence against it, but because he couldn't accept a world where human agency was an illusion. So he invented something. He called it the clinamen, a tiny, unpredictable swerve in the downward fall of atoms, infinitesimal, random, just enough to break the chain. It's a remarkable move when you think about it. Epicurus didn't have particle accelerators or probability theory. He had no experimental basis for this idea at all. He just looked at the logical architecture of total determinism and decided it needed a crack, a place where something genuinely new could enter the system. And so he postulated one, a wobble at the atomic level that would cascade upward into the space where choices are made. He was, in a strange way, anticipating the logic of quantum mechanics more than 2,000 years before Heisenberg and Bohr and the rest of them formalized it. The idea that at the smallest scales, the universe might not be perfectly predictable, that there might be genuine randomness woven into the fabric of things. Which brings us inevitably to the escape hatch that a lot of people reach for when the topic of determinism comes up. Quantum mechanics, the uncertainty principle, the idea that at the subatomic level events are not determined, that an electron doesn't have a precise position and momentum at the same time, that its behavior is governed by probability rather than certainty. And if the building blocks of reality are genuinely random, then Laplace's demon is blind, the chain is broken. The dominoes don't fall in a predictable pattern because some of them wobble on their own. It sounds like exactly what we need, doesn't it? A crack in the clockwork, Epicurus's swerve but with experimental backing. The problem is that most physicists who have thought carefully about this consider it a dead end. Not because quantum mechanics is wrong, it's one of the most precisely confirmed theories in the history of science, but because randomness and freedom are not the same thing. And this is a distinction that matters enormously, even though it's easy to blur. The physicist Carlo Rovelli has put this quite clearly. Even if subatomic events are genuinely random, even if there really is no hidden variable, no deeper pattern, no secret clockwork beneath the quantum probabilities, that doesn't give you free will. It gives you noise. A decision made by the roll of quantum dice is no more yours than a decision made by Laplace's clockwork. You didn't choose the outcome either way. In one version, the universe chose for you through an unbroken chain of causes. In the other, the universe chose for you through a coin flip. Neither one is freedom in any meaningful sense. And there's a practical problem, too, one that often gets overlooked. The thermal motion of molecules in your body, just the ordinary jostling of warm matter, already introduces far more randomness into your neural activity than any quantum effect at the level of individual neurons. Your brain is warm, it's wet, it's noisy. If quantum randomness were the secret ingredient of free will, you'd expect to find it playing a significant role in how neurons fire. But the noise that's already there, the ordinary thermal chaos of being a biological system at 98.6 degrees, swamps any quantum contribution. It's like trying to hear a whisper at a rock concert. So the quantum escape hatch closes, not with a dramatic slam, but with a quiet click. Epicurus's swerve was a beautiful idea, genuinely ahead of its time, but even its modern incarnation doesn't deliver what we want it to deliver. Randomness breaks the chain of determinism, sure, but it replaces it with something equally outside your control. Which leaves us in an odd place. The clockwork universe says your choices were determined. The quantum universe says some events are random, and in neither case did you actually choose. The night sky doesn't care which version is true. The stars burn the same way in both. And you're still here, still listening, still, for all practical purposes, making decisions about what to think about next, even if the nature of that making is a deeper puzzle than it first appeared. That puzzle, whether anyone truly chooses, didn't begin with brain scanners or particle accelerators. It's older than any laboratory, older really than the idea of a laboratory. And it showed up independently in civilizations that had no contact with one another, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of silence, which tells you something. When completely different cultures, thinking in completely different languages, arrive at the same unsettling question. Maybe the question isn't a quirk of Western philosophy. Maybe it's just what happens when human beings sit still long enough to notice how little control they seem to have. So let's go back, way back, to India around the 5th century BCE, a full 100 years before the Greek Stoics, before Aristotle, before most of the names you'd recognize from a philosophy textbook. There was a thinker named Makkhali Gosala. He founded a school called the Ajivikas, and what they taught was, by any measure, the most extreme determinism anyone has ever put into words. Not just things tend to follow patterns, not just the universe has laws. Gosala taught something called niyati, cosmic fate, and by that he meant everything, every raindrop, every birth, every cruelty and every kindness, all of it completely fixed from the beginning with no room for deviation. None. And here's what made the Ajivikas genuinely radical, even among determinists. They said that moral action, being good, being generous, meditating, all of it has absolutely no causal power. Zero, it doesn't speed anything up, it doesn't slow anything down, it doesn't nudge the universe one fraction of a degree in any direction. Every soul, Gosala taught, will eventually reach liberation. That part's guaranteed, but only after completing a precise, predetermined number of rebirths. He compared it to a ball of thread that has to unravel completely before it can stop. You can't pull it faster, you can't cut it short, you just wait. You live each life, one after another, and the thread unwinds at exactly the pace it was always going to unwind, and nothing you do, nothing, changes the length of that thread. It's a hard teaching. Most people in Gosala's own time found it hard. The Buddhists and Jains argued against him fiercely, but sit with it for a moment. There's something almost peaceful buried in there underneath the severity. If nothing you do can speed up or slow down the process, then there's nothing to anxiously optimize, no spiritual performance to maintain. You're just here unraveling at exactly the pace you were always going to. The thread knows its own length. Now, fast forward about 250 years and move a few thousand miles west to the Greek-speaking world. A Stoic philosopher named Chrysippus is wrestling with the same basic problem. Everything seems determined, so how can anyone be responsible for anything? And he comes at it from a completely different angle than Gosala. Chrysippus had a metaphor, a simple one, almost childishly simple, which is probably why it survived for over 2,000 years. He said, if you push a cylinder down a hill, it rolls straight. If you push a cone down the same hill, it rolls in a circle. Same push, same hill, different paths. And the difference isn't caused by the push, it's caused by the shape of the object. That's it, that's the whole argument in miniature. External events, the push, might set you in motion. But your character, your particular shape, determines how you respond. The cylinder can't help rolling straight, the cone can't help curving, and you can't help responding to the world in the way that your nature disposes you to respond. But and this is where Chrysippus parts company with Gosala, that response is still yours. It comes from your shape, it expresses something about what you are. So even in a fully determined universe, you're not just a passive victim of fate. You're a participant, a rolling thing with your own geometry. It's a gentler version of determinism. It says, yes, everything is caused, everything follows from what came before, but you are one of the causes. Your character is part of the chain. You're not watching the chain from outside, you're a link in it. And being a link, Chrysippus thought, is enough to ground responsibility. Enough to say, this action came from you, even if you were shaped by everything that preceded you. Whether that's actually enough, well, that's a question people are still arguing about, but there's something appealing about it in the quiet of the evening. You don't have to be an uncaused cause, some impossible thing that creates itself from nothing to matter. You just have to be a shape that the world passes through and comes out different on the other side. A few centuries later and a few thousand miles in yet another direction, the same question erupted again. This time in the early Islamic world, where the stakes felt even higher because the question wasn't just philosophical, it was theological. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing, and if God wills everything that happens, then does anyone actually choose to sin? Does anyone actually choose to pray? Or is every human action just God's will wearing a human mask? By the 8th century, this had fractured Islamic theology into three rival camps, and the disagreements between them were not polite academic differences. They mattered, they shaped empires. On one side, the Jabriyya, they took the hardest line, God's will completely determines every human act. You raise your hand because God wills it. You lower it because God wills that too. Human freedom is an illusion, and to claim otherwise is to limit God's sovereignty. It's Gosala's Niyati dressed in monotheistic clothing, though the Jabriyya probably never heard of Gosala. On the other side, the Qadariyya, they pushed back with equal force. No, humans have genuine, radical free will. God gave us the capacity to choose, and our choices are truly our own. To say otherwise makes God the author of evil, and they weren't willing to accept that. And then, threading the needle between them, the Ash'arites, they developed a concept called kasb, sometimes translated as acquisition. The idea is subtle and honestly a little slippery, which might be the point. God creates every action, every movement of every atom, every flicker of every thought, all of it is God's creation. But humans acquire moral responsibility for the actions that pass through them. God creates the act, you acquire the ownership of it. The deed is God's, the accountability is yours. If that sounds like it's trying to have it both ways, it is, deliberately. The Ash'arites were doing something that Western philosophy wouldn't get around to naming for centuries, compatibilism. The attempt to hold determinism and moral responsibility together, not by resolving the contradiction, but by reframing it, by saying maybe the contradiction is only apparent. Maybe God determines everything, and you are responsible, aren't actually in conflict, if you understand responsibility the right way. It's a lot like Chrysippus and his cylinder when you think about it. The push comes from outside, but the shape or the acquisition is yours. Three civilizations, three completely independent attempts to face the same uncomfortable truth, that the world seems to run on causes and we seem to be caught in the middle of them. Gosala said surrender to it, Chrysippus said participate in it. The Ash'arite said God creates it, but you own it, different answers. But the question, the late night, staring at the ceiling question, was always the same. And none of them could quite make it go away. So the question traveled west. and when it arrived in 17th-century Amsterdam, it found perhaps the loneliest philosopher who ever lived. Baruch Spinoza was a lens grinder. He spent his days polishing glass for microscopes and telescopes, and his nights polishing ideas that would get him expelled from his own Jewish community at the age of 23. The excommunication was total. No one was to speak to him, do business with him, or stand within 6 feet of him. His crime was thinking too clearly about things most people preferred to leave blurry. What Spinoza worked out, published in 1677, the year he died, was a vision of reality so stark and so complete that people are still arguing about it. He said that God and nature are the same thing, not that God made nature or that nature reflects God, but that they're identical. Deus sive natura, God or nature, one substance, one reality. Everything that exists is a piece of it, and everything that happens follows from it with the same kind of necessity that. Well, he used a geometric example, which is very Spinoza. The angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. They don't choose to. They don't sometimes add up to 179 because they're feeling rebellious. It follows from what a triangle is. And Spinoza said, you are the same way. Your choices follow from what you are, your body, your history, your desires, the situation you're in, with exactly that kind of inevitability. Now you might expect that to be a grim conclusion. A person who believes that nobody could ever have done anything differently, you'd think they'd be bitter or resigned or at least a little depressed about it. But Spinoza wasn't any of those things, and this is the part that makes him unusual, even among determinists. He said that understanding was freedom, not freedom in the sense that you could suddenly do otherwise. You still can't. The triangle's angles don't change just because you understand geometry, but something shifts in how you relate to it. When you truly understand why you did what you did, not just the surface reasons, but the deep causes, the whole chain, then the sting goes out of regret. You stop torturing yourself with, I should have, and if only. Not because you've given up, but because you've seen the full picture, and there's a kind of peace in that seeing. Spinoza thought that was the highest state a human being could reach. He called it blessedness, which is a strange word for a man who'd been thrown out of his congregation, but he meant it. He died at 44 from lung disease probably caused by years of inhaling glass dust from his lens grinding. His major work was published by friends after his death, and for about a century, most of European philosophy pretended he didn't exist. But the question didn't go away. It never does. About 160 years later, a considerably less lonely but far more pessimistic philosopher picked it up. Arthur Schopenhauer entered a competition held by the Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences in 1839, an essay contest on the freedom of the will. He won. And the sentence he's most remembered for is one of those formulations that, once you hear it, you can't quite unhear it. A person can do what they will, but they cannot will what they will. Sit with that for a moment. It sounds like a riddle, but it's not. It's actually painfully straightforward. You chose what you had for breakfast this morning. Maybe it was toast, maybe it was eggs. Nobody held your hand, nobody forced you. In the ordinary sense, it was your choice freely made. But and here's where Schopenhauer twists the knife gently. Did you choose to want toast? Did you select from some menu of possible desires the craving that nudged you toward the bread and not the eggs? Or did that preference just show up, assembled by your genetics, your habits, what you ate yesterday, how you slept, some advertisement you half noticed 3 days ago? You can do what you will, that part's obvious. The trouble is upstream. The will itself, the wanting, the preferring, the leaning toward, arrives already formed. You don't build it, you receive it, and then you act on it and call the whole process freedom. Schopenhauer thought this was the clearest way to state the problem, and honestly, it might be. It doesn't require any physics. It doesn't require God or nature or substance metaphysics. It's just a careful observation about what happens when you watch your own mind make a decision. The choice is yours. The desire behind the choice is not. Which brings us to someone who took Schopenhauer very seriously, perhaps more seriously than any other person in the 20th century. Albert Einstein kept only 3 portraits on the wall of his study in Berlin. 2 of them made perfect sense, Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell, the physicists whose work on electromagnetism Einstein had built upon and transformed. The third was Arthur Schopenhauer, the only non-scientist on the wall. That detail alone says something. Einstein could have hung anyone up there. He admired plenty of thinkers, but in his personal space, the room where he actually worked and thought, he chose to look at Schopenhauer's face every day, and he was quite open about why. He said that Schopenhauer's words accompanied me in all situations throughout my life and reconciled me with the actions of others, even if they were rather painful to me. Think about what that means practically. Einstein dealt with betrayals, professional jealousies, political persecution, the weaponization of his own discoveries. And what got him through it, not entirely but meaningfully, was the idea that the people who hurt him couldn't have done otherwise, that their cruelty or smallness or cowardice followed from what they were, the way the angles follow from the triangle. It didn't make the pain smaller, but it made the anger dissolve a little. If someone truly couldn't have acted differently, then rage at them is like rage at gravity. You can feel it, but it doesn't make much sense. Einstein declared himself a determinist outright. He didn't hedge. He didn't say it's complicated or, well, quantum mechanics might leave room for, and he of all people could have since he helped invent quantum mechanics. But he didn't think indeterminacy at the subatomic level rescued free will. He thought it was just noise. And he said something that captures the strange double life of a thoughtful determinist better than almost anything else I've come across. I am compelled to act as if freedom of the will existed, because if I wish to live in a civilized society, I must act responsibly. Compelled to act as if. There's a quiet humor in that phrasing if you catch it. Even the decision to behave as though he had free will wasn't really a free decision. It was compelled by his values, his circumstances, his understanding of how societies work. Determinism all the way down, even in the choice to set determinism aside for practical purposes. So here's where the Western tradition arrived by the mid-20th century. Spinoza said, you can't do otherwise, but understanding that is freedom. Schopenhauer said, you can act on your will, but your will isn't yours to choose. And Einstein, arguably the most celebrated mind of the modern era, looked at both of those ideas and said, yes, that's how it is, and I can live with that. I can even find a kind of gentleness in it. 3 thinkers spread across 3 centuries, each pressing the same bruise, and each finding not exactly comfort, but something close to it, a way to hold the idea without flinching. So the philosophers have had their say. Spinoza, Schopenhauer, Einstein, they approached the problem from the outside, with logic and metaphor and a kind of resigned elegance. But while they were building their arguments, something else was happening in laboratories, something that would make the philosophical case feel almost gentle by comparison. Because neuroscience wasn't content to simply argue that you might not have free will. It started showing what's actually going on inside the skull when you think you're making a choice. And what it found is, honestly, a little hard to sit with. Let's start with Michael Gazzaniga. In the 1960s and 70s, he was working with patients who'd had their corpus callosum severed, the thick bundle of fibers connecting the 2 hemispheres of the brain. This was a surgical treatment for severe epilepsy, and it left the patients functioning remarkably well in daily life, but in carefully designed experiments, something strange emerged. Gazzaniga could present information to just one hemisphere at a time. So he'd show the right hemisphere, which controls the left hand, a picture of a snow scene, and separately the left hemisphere would see a picture of a chicken claw. Then he'd ask the patient to point to a related image with each hand. The left hand, guided by the right hemisphere, pointed to a shovel. Makes sense, snow, shovel. The right hand, guided by the left hemisphere, pointed to a chicken. Also makes sense, chicken claw, chicken. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. When Gazzaniga asked the patient why the left hand was pointing to the shovel, something remarkable happened. The left hemisphere, the verbal one, the one that does the talking, hadn't seen the snow scene. It had no idea why the left hand had chosen the shovel. It had zero access to the actual reason. And yet it answered without hesitation, "Oh, you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed." No pause, no uncertainty, just a confident, completely fabricated explanation that happened to incorporate what the left hemisphere did know about the chicken. It wasn't lying, exactly. It genuinely seemed to believe its own story. It had constructed a perfectly plausible reason for an action whose true cause it could never have known. Gazzaniga called this the left hemisphere interpreter, and he came to believe it wasn't some quirk unique to split-brain patients. It was a fundamental feature of how all human brains work. We have a module or something like a module that constantly watches what we do and then generates explanations for why we did it. Narratives, reasons, justifications. And these stories feel so immediate, so self-evident, that we never think to question whether they're accurate. The unsettling implication is this: maybe all of us every day are doing exactly what that split-brain patient did, acting for reasons we can't access and then telling ourselves stories about why we acted. Not occasionally, not in edge cases, all the time. The interpreter never stops running. It never says, "I don't know why I did that." It always has an answer, and the answer always sounds right. Which brings us to Thomas Metzinger, a German philosopher who spent decades trying to understand what the self actually is. His answer is not reassuring. Metzinger's central idea, what he calls the ego tunnel thesis, is that your conscious self is not a thing. It's not an entity sitting somewhere behind your eyes watching the world and making decisions. It's a simulation, a model the brain builds in real time of its own processing, a kind of low-dimensional summary of enormously complex neural activity rendered in a format that feels like you. And the trick, the really disorienting part, is that you can never experience it as a model. From the inside, it doesn't feel like a representation. It feels like reality. It feels like there's genuinely someone home. The brain builds this self-model, and then this is Metzinger's key insight: it can't see through its own creation. The simulation is transparent in the technical sense. You look right through it, the way you look through a clean window without noticing the glass. So the you that seems to be freely choosing, the you that feels like the author of your decisions, that's itself a kind of controlled hallucination. Not a hallucination in the sense of seeing things that aren't there, but in the sense of a constructed experience that presents itself as unmediated reality. The chooser behind the choices is itself a product of the same processes it thinks it's directing. It's a strange loop to try to think about. The thing doing the thinking about whether it's real is itself the thing whose reality is in question. Metzinger doesn't think this should make us despair, but he's honest that it's genuinely difficult to absorb. Most of us will read his argument, nod along, and then go right back to feeling like a unified self making free choices. The simulation is that good. And then there's Robert Sapolsky, the Stanford neuroendocrinologist, who in 2023 published a book called Determined that essentially tries to close every remaining escape hatch. Sapolsky's argument is about causal chains, not in the abstract way that Laplace imagined, with a demon computing the trajectory of every atom, in a concrete, biological way. He walks through the layers of causation behind any given decision, and there are so many layers. You made a choice just now. Why? Well, partly because of your current blood sugar level, which affects how your prefrontal cortex is functioning, which affects your impulse control. But your blood sugar is a product of what you ate this morning, which is a product of your dietary habits, which are shaped by your childhood, which was shaped by your parents' stress levels, which were shaped by their economic circumstances, which were shaped by, and it keeps going. Sapolsky traces these chains all the way back before birth. The level of stress hormones in your mother's blood during pregnancy shaped how your amygdala developed. The reward and punishment patterns you experienced as a toddler shaped your dopamine system. Your genes, which you didn't choose, interact with environments, which you also didn't choose, to produce the brain that's sitting here right now, thinking it's freely deliberating. Every link in the chain is explicable. Every link had a cause, and at no point in the sequence is there a gap where a free, uncaused choice slips in. But Sapolsky doesn't stop at the demolition. His most striking claim is about what should follow from genuinely accepting all this, and his answer is surprising, given how bleak the picture might seem: compassion. Someone does something terrible, and Sapolsky doesn't shy away from terrible examples. The question becomes whether they could have done otherwise, given the exact brain they had at that exact moment, shaped by the exact history that produced it. And his answer is no, not in some hand-wavy philosophical sense, in a biological, mechanistic, traceable sense, which means that hatred, that deep moral anger we aim at people who do wrong, starts to lose its footing. You can still protect society. You can still restrain people who are dangerous, but you can't, if you've really followed the argument, hate them for something they were never actually free to avoid. It's a hard landing, that idea, not because it's cruel, but because it asks you to give up something that feels essential, the sense that people deserve blame in some ultimate way. Sapolsky knows this. He admits he can't fully live by his own conclusion, but he thinks the direction matters, that even a partial acceptance of it makes the world a little less punitive, a little more willing to understand. So here we are, the interpreter fabricates your reasons, the ego tunnel fabricates yourself, and the causal chains behind both stretch back further than you can see. 3 different angles, 3 different researchers, all pointing at the same absence, the place where the chooser was supposed to be and isn't. So the case looks pretty damning. 5 sections of evidence, all converging on the same uncomfortable conclusion, that the self who chooses is a kind of fiction, and the feeling of deciding is just the brain narrating a process that already happened without you. But here's the thing about intellectual honesty. It cuts in every direction, and if we're going to take seriously the evidence against free will, we also have to take seriously the complications, the places where the story gets messier, where the data doesn't cooperate, and where even the people who made the discoveries disagree about what they mean. Start with Libet himself. Benjamin Libet, the man whose readiness potential experiment became the single most cited piece of evidence against free will. He didn't actually think he'd disproved it. That's one of the stranger ironies in all of neuroscience. The researcher whose work gets invoked every time someone argues that your decisions are made before you know about them. He thought his findings were compatible with free will, just not the kind most people have in mind. Libet proposed was something he called free won't. The idea is simple, almost deceptively so. Yes, the brain begins gearing up for an action before you're consciously aware of wanting to do it. That 550 millisecond head start is real. But Libet noticed something else in his data. There's a window, roughly the last 200 milliseconds before the action actually happens, where conscious awareness has already come online. And in that window, participants could cancel the action. They could veto it. The unconscious process starts the engine, but consciousness can still slam the brakes. It's a bit like a governor who didn't initiate the trial, didn't choose the defendant, didn't set the court date, but who still holds the power of a last-second pardon. You don't get to pick which impulses arise, but you might get to decide which ones you act on. It's a humbler version of freedom than the one we usually celebrate, but Libet thought it was real, and he spent the rest of his career defending it. Not everyone found that convincing, of course. Plenty of neuroscientists pointed out that the veto itself could be just another unconscious process, that the brain's decision to cancel is no more free than the brain's decision to initiate, and that's a fair objection, but it does complicate the neat narrative. The man who found the evidence wasn't convinced by the conclusion everyone else drew from it. That should give us pause. And then the evidence itself started looking different. In 2012, a neuroscientist named Aaron Scherger published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that offered a genuinely different way to read Libet's data. For decades, the standard interpretation had been that the readiness potential, that slow electrical buildup before a voluntary movement, was the brain making a decision. Your unconscious mind choosing before your conscious mind knew. But Scherger's team proposed something else entirely. What if that electrical buildup wasn't a decision at all? What if it was just noise? Neural noise specifically. The brain is constantly humming with random electrical fluctuations, stochastic activity that doesn't mean anything in particular, the way ocean waves don't have a destination. Schrödinger's model showed that the readiness potential could be explained as random fluctuations in the motor cortex that occasionally, by chance, cross a threshold. When the noise happens to be riding high at the moment you're loosely intending to move your finger, you move it. When it's low, you wait a bit longer. On this reading, participants in Libet's experiment weren't being puppeteered by unconscious decisions. There was no hidden decider making the call 550 milliseconds before they knew. They were just more likely to act when the random hum of their neural activity happened to be peaking. Which is, well, it's unsettling in its own way, honestly, because the old interpretation at least had someone at the wheel, even if it was your unconscious mind rather than your conscious self. Schrödinger's version suggests the trigger might be no one at all. Not your conscious mind, not your unconscious mind, just the statistical behavior of neurons firing in patterns that look meaningful from the outside but might be as purposeless as static. It trades one kind of discomfort for another. So the neuroscience is messier than it first appeared, and when you move from neuroscience to physics, it gets messier still, but in the opposite direction. Instead of complications that soften the case against free will, physics offers a version of determinism so extreme that even most determinists back away from it. Sabine Hossenfelder, the German physicist, has become one of the most vocal advocates for what's called superdeterminism. The idea goes further than regular determinism, much further. It's not just that your decisions are determined by prior causes. It's that everything is determined by prior causes, including things we normally think of as arbitrary or random. When a physicist in a lab chooses to measure a particle's spin along one axis rather than another, superdeterminism says that choice was fixed at the Big Bang. The initial conditions of the universe guaranteed that this particular physicist, in this particular lab on this particular Tuesday, would rotate her detector to this particular angle. Hossenfelder doesn't mince words about it. She calls free will logically incoherent nonsense. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting as a philosophical problem rather than just a scientific claim. Physicist Anton Zeilinger, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on quantum entanglement, has pointed out that if Hossenfelder is right, science itself has a problem, a serious one, because science depends on the idea that experimenters can freely choose what to test. If every experimental setup was predetermined since the beginning of the universe, then the results don't tell you about nature, they tell you about the initial conditions. You can't falsify a theory if the test was rigged from the start, not by anyone, but by the blind mechanics of a universe that couldn't have unfolded any other way. Superdeterminism doesn't just eliminate free will. It threatens to eliminate the method we'd use to prove it was eliminated. And then there's maybe the strangest contribution to this whole debate from mathematics of all places. In 2006, John Conway, the British mathematician famous for inventing the game of life, teamed up with Simon Kochen to prove what they called the free will theorem. It's a formal mathematical proof, not a philosophical argument, and it says something genuinely weird. The theorem starts with a conditional. If an experimenter has free will in choosing how to measure a particle, if that choice isn't determined by everything that came before, then the particle's response can't be determined by everything that came before either. The math is rigorous. It follows from basic properties of quantum mechanics that most physicists accept. The conclusion is almost absurdly binary. Either humans and subatomic particles both have something like free will, some capacity for responses that aren't dictated by prior history, or neither does. There's no middle ground where humans are determined but particles are free, or vice versa. Whatever ontological status you give to human choice, you have to give the same status to the behavior of electrons. Conway reportedly loved this result, partly because of how uncomfortable it made people. Physicists who were happy to say particles have irreducible randomness suddenly got nervous when told they had to extend the same courtesy to human beings. and hard determinists who insisted human choices were fully caused had to accept that particle behavior was too, which most interpretations of quantum mechanics say it isn't. So the debate is nowhere close to settled. The man who found the most famous evidence against free will thought it was compatible with free will. A reanalysis of his data suggests the evidence might have been noise all along. The most extreme version of determinism threatens to undermine science itself, and a mathematical proof says that if you deny freedom to humans, you have to deny it to every particle in the universe. The ground that looked so solid a few minutes ago is shifting, not toward any easy answer, but away from the certainty that there was never a question to begin with. So where does that leave us? We've spent a while now walking through the arguments, the neuroscience, the physics, the ancient traditions, the complications. And if you've been following along, you might have noticed something. The debate keeps circling. Determinism says your choices are fixed. The quantum escape hatch doesn't really help. The neuroscience is murkier than it first appeared. And through all of it, there's this nagging question that nobody seems to fully resolve. If everything that happens was always going to happen, does anything you do actually matter? Most professional philosophers, the people who have spent their careers turning this question over, have landed on an answer, and it's not the one you might expect. They say yes, it matters, even if determinism is true. But getting there required dismantling something that had been assumed for a very long time. For roughly 2,000 years, the standard defense of moral responsibility went something like this. You're responsible for what you do because you could have done otherwise. You chose to lie, but you could have told the truth. You chose to help, but you could have walked away. That ability to have acted differently, that was the thing, the cornerstone. Without it, responsibility seemed to collapse. Then in 1969, a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt published a thought experiment that pulled that cornerstone out. Quietly, almost gently, but it changed the entire conversation. Here's what he asked people to consider. There's a man named Jones, and he's about to vote in an election. Unbeknownst to Jones, a neuroscientist named Black is monitoring his brain activity. Black wants Jones to vote Democrat, and Black has the technology to intervene, to reach into Jones's neural processes and force the vote if it looks like Jones is going to choose otherwise. Black is standing by, ready to act. But Jones votes Democrat on his own. He walks into the booth, makes his choice, and Black never has to do a thing, never even lifts a finger. Jones chose freely, at least it felt free. It looked free. He deliberated, he weighed his options, and he decided. Except here's the thing, Jones could not have done otherwise. If he'd started leaning toward voting Republican, Black would have stepped in and forced the outcome. The alternative path was sealed off. There was no possible world in which Jones voted differently. And yet, doesn't it still feel like Jones is responsible for his vote? He made the decision. He went through the process. The fact that an unused safety net existed in the background doesn't seem to change what Jones actually did or why he did it. Frankfurt thought so. He argued that could have done otherwise was never really the foundation of responsibility. It was a red herring. What matters isn't whether you had metaphysical options branching out in front of you. What matters is whether the action came from you, from your reasoning, your values, your deliberation. The process matters. The source matters. The existence of roads you didn't take and apparently couldn't take is beside the point. It's a strange argument to sit with, because on one hand it feels like a trick, like he's redefined the question to avoid answering it. But on the other hand, once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Most of the time when we hold people responsible, we're not actually checking whether they could have done otherwise in some absolute metaphysical sense. We're checking whether they meant to do it, whether they understood what they were doing, whether the action reflected who they are. Frankfurt didn't solve the free will problem, but he removed one of its load-bearing walls and showed the building could still stand. Daniel Dennett took that insight and ran with it for decades. Dennett was probably compatibilism's most forceful public defender, a philosopher who could be blunt, funny, and occasionally exasperating in equal measure, and he had a particular gift for cutting through what he saw as confused questions. His contribution was a reframe, a word actually, evitability. The opposite of inevitability. Dennett argued that the whole debate about free will in the grand metaphysical sense, the power to have done otherwise in a physically identical universe, some ghostly capacity that floats above the causal chain, was asking for the wrong thing. Not just unattainable, but not even useful. If you could somehow step outside the laws of physics and make a truly uncaused choice, what would that even look like? It wouldn't be based on your values, because those are shaped by experience. It wouldn't be based on your reasoning, because that's a physical process in your brain. It would just be random, arbitrary, and randomness isn't freedom. We covered that already with the quantum coin flip. So Dennett said, forget that version of free will. It's not worth wanting. What is worth wanting is evitability, the ability to foresee consequences and steer around them, to see the truck coming and step out of the way, to recognize that a decision will hurt someone and choose differently. And this ability, he pointed out, isn't some all-or-nothing thing. It exists on a spectrum. A thermostat has a rudimentary version of it. It detects temperature and adjusts. A chess-playing computer has more. It evaluates positions, anticipates consequences, and selects moves to avoid losing. A human being has the richest version yet. We can model the future. We can simulate outcomes. We can think about what kind of person we want to be and adjust our behavior accordingly. That graduated, evolved capacity, shaped by billions of years of natural selection, is real. It's measurable. It's what actually matters when we talk about making choices, and determinism doesn't threaten it at all. The fact that your foresight and your steering are themselves products of prior causes doesn't make them less real or less yours. Your ability to avoid harm is a feature of how you're built. Calling it an illusion because it runs on physics is like calling a computer's calculations an illusion because they run on electricity. Now you might find this satisfying, or you might find it feels like a consolation prize, like being told you don't have the thing you wanted, but here's something almost as good. Both reactions are fair. Compatibilism has its critics, and we'll hear from them, but it's worth nodding where the professional consensus actually sits. In 2020, the Phil Papers survey polled nearly 1,800 professional philosophers, people across every subfield, from ethics to metaphysics to philosophy of mind. They were asked where they stood on free will, and 59.2% accepted or leaned toward compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism are not in conflict, that you can live in a fully determined universe and still make choices that matter. Only 11.2% denied free will outright. That's worth pausing on, not because a majority vote settles a philosophical question, it doesn't, but because it tells you something about what happens when you sit with this problem long enough. The people who think about it most carefully, who have read Frankfurt and Dennett and their critics' critics, don't mostly conclude that choice is meaningless. They don't mostly throw up their hands and say nothing matters. They find a way through. Whether that way through is the right one, that's a different question, and it's one we're not done with yet. There's a diary entry from April 30, 1870, that reads like someone pulling themselves out of quicksand by their own hair. William James, who would go on to become one of the most influential philosophers America ever produced, was, at that point, nobody. He was a young man living in his father's house, unable to work, unable to decide on a career, unable to do much of anything. He'd been suffering from crippling depression and panic attacks for years. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't concentrate. He'd trained as a physician but never practiced. He'd studied chemistry, then anatomy, then biology, and abandoned each one. His body hurt. His mind hurt worse. And the thing that was destroying him wasn't some external catastrophe. It was an idea. He'd been reading the determinists, the materialists, the physiologists who were arguing that human beings were just complex machines, that every thought and feeling was the inevitable product of prior physical states. and he believed them. That was the problem. He found their arguments convincing. And if they were right, then his suffering was pointless, his choices were illusions, and there was nothing he could do about any of it because there was no he doing anything in the first place. He was, by his own account, close to the edge. And then on that April morning, he wrote this in his diary: "My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." Read that again slowly. It's a paradox, and he knew it was a paradox. If free will doesn't exist, then this decision to believe in it wasn't really a decision. It was just another domino falling. And if free will does exist, then he didn't need to bootstrap himself into believing it. Either way, the statement seems to collapse under its own logic. But James didn't care about the logic. He cared about what happened next, and what happened next was that he got better. Not immediately, not magically, but steadily. He started working. He started writing. He accepted a teaching position at Harvard. He built a psychology lab. He developed an entire philosophical framework, pragmatism, built around the idea that the truth of a belief should be judged not by whether it perfectly mirrors some hidden metaphysical reality, but by what it does, by its consequences, by whether it helps you live. Which is itself a kind of answer to the free will question, just not the kind that satisfies people who want a clean yes or no. James wasn't saying free will is real and here's the proof. He was saying the belief in free will pulled me out of a pit. It gave me traction. It let me function. And if that's not truth, it's something close enough to truth that the difference stops mattering at 3 a.m. when you can't get out of bed. You can dismiss that as wishful thinking. Plenty of philosophers have. But there's a harder version of the same argument, and it showed up in a psychology lab about 140 years later. In 2008, Kathleen Vohs and Jonathan Schooler ran a study that's become one of the most cited in the free will literature. They took 2 groups of participants. One group read passages from Francis Crick's book arguing that free will is an illusion, that were nothing more than the behavior of nerve cells and their associated molecules. The other group read neutral passages about the brain that didn't take a position on free will. Then both groups were given a task where they could cheat for a small financial reward. The group that had just read the anti-free will passages cheated significantly more. Now there are things to say about this study. It's been debated, partially replicated, criticized on methodological grounds. Social psychology has a replication problem, and nobody should hang their worldview on a single experiment. But the finding points at something that's hard to dismiss entirely. The belief that you have agency, that your choices matter, that you're the author of your actions, seems to function as a kind of moral scaffolding. Not because it's necessarily true in some deep metaphysical sense, but because when you remove it, something in the structure of ethical behavior starts to sag. It's like a load-bearing wall. You can argue about whether it's architecturally necessary. You can point out that the house might stand without it, but maybe don't knock it out without checking what's upstairs first. This is where the conversation gets genuinely uncomfortable, because it stops being about what's true and starts being about what we can afford to believe. And the place where the stakes are highest, where this stops being a thought experiment and starts being about real human suffering, is criminal justice. Robert Sapolsky has been very direct about this. If you take determinism seriously, he argues, you can't keep the punishment system we have. Not because you'd let everyone go, that's the straw man, and it misses the point entirely. You'd still need to separate dangerous people from the rest of society. You'd still need consequences for harmful behavior, but the entire moral logic underneath our current system would have to be rebuilt. Right now, the system runs on retribution. Someone does something terrible and we punish them, and the punishment is supposed to be proportional to how wrong their choice was. The worse the choice, the worse the suffering we inflict. That's not an accident or a side effect, it's the design. The system is built on the idea that people deserve to suffer for choosing badly. But if nobody's really choosing, if every action is the end of a causal chain that stretches back through genetics and childhood and neurochemistry and 1,000 other things nobody picked, then what does deserve even mean? You're punishing someone for being the person that the universe made them, which starts to look less like justice and more like cruelty with paperwork. Sapolsky's not alone in this. The philosophers Dirk Pereboom and Greg Caruso have spent years formalizing what a post-free will justice system might actually look like. Their model is quarantine, not punishment, not revenge, not "you need to learn your lesson" quarantine, the same logic we apply to infectious disease. When someone has a dangerous, contagious illness, we separate them from the population, not because we hate them, not because they deserve to be isolated, not because we think suffering will teach the virus a lesson. We do it because it protects everyone else and because we're trying to treat the person so they can eventually rejoin society. There's no moral rage in it. There's no sentencing hearing where we decide how much the sick person should suffer based on how bad their disease is. We just do what works. Pereboom and Caruso argue we could do the same thing with criminal behavior, contain the danger, focus entirely on rehabilitation and prevention. Remove the moral fury that currently drives sentencing, the fury that leads us to give one person 5 years and another person 50 for crimes that caused similar harm, because we've decided one of them was more evil, more deserving of pain. It's a radical proposal, and most people's gut reaction to it is resistance, deep, visceral resistance, because it means looking at someone who's done something genuinely monstrous and saying, "I'm not going to hate you for this. I'm going to treat you the way I'd treat a natural disaster, something to be managed, contained, understood, not something to be punished for existing." That's a hard place to get to. James couldn't live without believing in choice. The Vos study suggests that believing in choice might be part of what keeps people honest. And yet here's Sapolsky and Pereboom asking what happens if we follow the thread all the way down, if we take the absence of free will not as a dark conclusion to be avoided, but as a starting point for building something more humane. 3 different answers to the same question, not which one is right, which one we can live with. That last question, which one we can live with, turns out to have older answers than you might expect, and some of them are surprisingly gentle. Dirk Pereboom is a philosopher who spent decades working through an idea most people find unsettling on first hearing. He calls his position hard incompatibilism, the view that free will in any meaningful sense simply doesn't exist, not the compatibilists' redefined version, not the libertarians' quantum-flavored version. None of it, and what makes Pereboom unusual isn't the conclusion itself. We've met that conclusion before from Spinoza, from Sapolsky, from others. What makes him unusual is what he thinks should follow from it. Most people assume that giving up free will means giving up everything that matters, purpose, connection, the motivation to get out of bed. Pereboom spent his career arguing the opposite. He thinks accepting that no one truly authors their own actions should make life better, not worse, and his reasoning is disarmingly simple. Think about moral anger, that hot, righteous fury you feel when someone wrongs you. The conviction that they chose to do this, that they could have done otherwise, that they deserve to suffer for it. Pereboom says, if no one could have done otherwise, that anger doesn't just become unjustified, it becomes unnecessary, it dissolves. Not because you force yourself to forgive, but because the foundation the anger was built on turns out to have been sand. And what's left once the anger drains away isn't emptiness. It's something closer to compassion. You still protect yourself from harm. You still hold people accountable the way you'd quarantine someone carrying a dangerous illness, not to punish them but to prevent further damage. But the retributive impulse, the desire to see someone suffer because they deserve it, that fades. And in its place, Pereboom argues everything worth keeping remains. Love, meaning, creativity, gratitude. None of these require the belief that you or anyone else is the ultimate originator of their actions. They just require being alive and paying attention. It's a strange kind of peace. The peace of putting down a weight you didn't realize you were carrying. And Paraboom isn't the first to find it, not by a long stretch. Marcus Aurelius ruled the Roman Empire from 161 to 180 CE. By most measures, he was one of the most powerful human beings who ever lived. He commanded legions, shaped laws, decided the fates of millions. And in his private journal, a journal he never intended anyone else to read, he kept returning to the same quiet conclusion. Everything he wrote flows from what he called providence, allied with necessity. The universe operates according to its nature. Events unfold as they must, and the wise response isn't to rage against this. It isn't to pretend you stand outside the current, directing it. The wise response is to align yourself with it, the way a river doesn't fight its banks. There's something striking about that image coming from a man with that much earthly power. He could have anyone executed with a word. He could redirect armies, reshape borders, rewrite the laws of an empire. And he sat alone at night, writing to himself that surrender, not control, was the path to peace. Not surrender as defeat, surrender as recognition, as settling into what is, rather than exhausting yourself against what you wish were different. His meditations became one of the most enduring books ever written about finding calm within a determined universe. Not because it offers clever arguments or complicated frameworks, because it reads like someone who actually lived it. Someone who held enormous power in his hands and still concluded, night after night, that the deepest freedom wasn't in exercising that power, but in releasing the need to. Half a world away, and centuries earlier, a different tradition arrived at something related through an entirely different path. Buddhism has a concept called pratityasamutpada, dependent origination, and it threads a needle that neither Western determinism nor libertarian free will quite manages. The idea is deceptively simple, but it reshapes everything once you sit with it. Nothing arises from a single cause, and nothing arises from no cause. Everything, every thought, every event, every moment of experience arises from an inconceivably vast web of conditions. The way a seed doesn't become a sprout through its own will or its own nature alone. It needs soil, it needs heat, it needs moisture, it needs time. Remove any one condition and the sprout doesn't appear, but no single condition is the cause either. The sprout emerges from the relationship between all of them. This might sound like just another way of saying everything is determined, but the Buddhist tradition was careful to distinguish itself from exactly that view. There was a teacher contemporary with the Buddha, Makkhali Gosala, who taught strict fatalism. Everything is fixed, your actions are irrelevant. You'll arrive where you were always going to arrive regardless of what you do. The Buddha explicitly rejected this. He also rejected the opposite extreme, the idea that you are entirely self-created, that you float free of conditions, that you author yourself from nothing. That radical freedom the existentialists would later champion. Dependent origination lands between them, a middle way, and the liberation it offers isn't the liberation of escaping your conditions, it's the liberation of understanding them, of seeing the web clearly, the web of genetics and upbringing and culture and accident and timing that brought you to this exact moment, and no longer pretending you were ever outside it. You were always part of the web, you were always one of its threads, and there's something profoundly restful in that recognition. Not defeat, not passivity, just honesty, the kind of honesty that lets you stop clenching. 3 traditions, 3 different centuries, 3 different continents, and they converge on something remarkably similar, not an argument for or against free will, something quieter than that, a way of being with the question that doesn't require answering it. Paraboom finds it through careful analytic reasoning, strip away the illusion, and what remains is kinder than what you started with. Marcus Aurelius finds it through nightly practice, write it down, remind yourself, let go, again and again. Buddhism finds it through a metaphysics of interdependence. You aren't the author of your story, but you aren't separate from it either, and seeing that clearly is itself a kind of waking up. None of them ask you to believe something comfortable. They ask you to stop insisting on something that was never quite true, that you stand apart from the world, pulling levers, making things happen through sheer force of will, and in letting that go, something loosens, the grip relaxes, the jaw unclenches. It's late now, the arguments have quieted down. The neuroscientists and the physicists and the philosophers have all made their cases and left the room. And what remains in the silence after all that thinking might be the oldest insight of all. That peace was never about winning the debate, it was about outgrowing the need to. So there's this old Chinese story about a butcher. His name was Cook Ding, and he appears in the Zhuangzi, a text from around the 3rd century BCE that reads less like philosophy and more like a collection of strange, beautiful dreams someone wrote down before they forgot them. Cook Ding was famous not for anything grand, but for the way he carved oxen. He'd been doing it for 19 years, and in all that time he'd never had to sharpen his blade, not once. The secret, he said, wasn't skill exactly. It wasn't technique. It was that he'd stopped trying, not in the giving up sense, in the sense that he no longer experienced himself as separate from what he was doing. He didn't look at the ox and decide where to cut. He moved through the natural spaces between the joints, the gaps that were already there, the way water finds its way downhill without needing a map. His hands knew things his mind had stopped bothering to figure out. The blade moved. The meat fell apart, and there was no one in the middle taking credit for it. The Taoists had a word for this, Wu Wei. It gets translated as non-action or effortless action, but neither of those really captures it. It's not about doing nothing. It's not about being passive. It's about reaching a point where the boundary between you and what you're doing becomes so thin that action stops feeling like something you initiate and starts feeling like something that happens through you, like breathing, like the way your heart beats without anyone asking it to. And here's the quiet part. If you squint at Wu Wei from a certain angle, it looks almost identical to what a determinist would describe. Action without a deciding I behind it. Movement that arises from conditions rather than from some inner commander issuing orders. The Taoists arrived at this not through neuroscience or physics, but through watching rivers and trees and seasons, through paying attention to how things actually work when you stop insisting they work the way you want them to. Cook Ding wasn't fighting determinism. He wasn't even thinking about it. He was just carving an ox. But the state he described, that dissolution of the gap between self and situation, between the doer and the doing, is what happens when you stop gripping the steering wheel of a car that might be driving itself anyway. You don't crash, you just ride. There's a strange comfort in that, not a loud comfort, not the kind that comes with fireworks and certainty. More like the comfort of finally unclenching a fist you didn't realize was closed. About 22 centuries after Cook Ding put down his knife, a German philosopher with a magnificent mustache and a flair for the dramatic arrived at something surprisingly similar, though he'd have hated the comparison. Friedrich Nietzsche was not a calm man. He was intense, lonely, often in terrible physical pain, and he wrote like his pen was on fire. He was the last person you'd expect to make peace with the idea that everything is determined, and yet. He proposed a thought experiment. He called it the heaviest weight. It goes like this. A demon comes to you in your loneliest hour and tells you that everything you have ever lived, every moment of boredom, every heartbreak, every unremarkable Wednesday afternoon you will have to live again, and again, infinitely, in exactly the same sequence with nothing changed, nothing added, nothing removed, the same stubbed toes, the same moments of grace, the same losses, forever. Most people, Nietzsche figured, would collapse under this. The sheer horror of eternal repetition, of being trapped in the exact same life with no possibility of revision, it sounds like a punishment, a cosmic prison sentence. But Nietzsche wasn't interested in most people. He was interested in the person who could hear this and say yes, not reluctantly, not with gritted teeth, but with something that looked improbably like love. Yes, again, all of it, every last bit. He called this amor fati, love of fate, and it wasn't resignation, he was very clear about that. It wasn't the exhausted surrender of someone who's given up. It was more like the way a poet loves the constraints of a sonnet. 14 lines, a specific rhyme scheme, rules that seem like they should make the work smaller but somehow make it deeper. The poet doesn't write sonnets despite the constraints. The poet writes sonnets because the constraints create a shape that wouldn't exist without them. The limitation is the art. Amor Fati works the same way. If everything is necessary, if your life couldn't have gone differently, if every decision was the only decision that was ever going to happen, then the question isn't whether you're free. The question is whether you can love the shape of what is, whether you can stop mourning the lives you didn't live and find something like tenderness for the one you did. It's a strange kind of freedom, not freedom from necessity, but freedom inside it. The freedom of a bird that doesn't resent the air for pushing back against its wings, because without that resistance, flight wouldn't be possible at all. And maybe that's where Kukding and Nietzsche meet, in the only place two thinkers separated by 2 millennia and entirely different temperaments could meet, in the quiet space where you stop fighting what is. Kukding dissolves into the work until there's no gap between intention and action. Nietzsche embraces the whole thing so fiercely that necessity stops feeling like a cage and starts feeling like a partner. Neither of them solved the problem of free will, neither of them proved anything, but they both arrived by very different roads at the same strange intersection, that letting go of the need to be the one in control doesn't leave you powerless, it leaves you lighter. And that might be enough, not as an answer, just as a place to rest. The question of whether your decisions were ever really yours, it doesn't need to be settled tonight. It's been asked for thousands of years by people far smarter and far more troubled than any of us, and it's still open, still breathing, still worth thinking about on nights like this, when the world has gone quiet and your mind is doing that thing where it wanders without asking permission. Maybe free will is real and everything we've talked about is just an interesting detour. Maybe it isn't, and the feeling of choosing is the universe's most elaborate inside joke. Or maybe, and this is the one that settles easiest, the one that feels most like a pillow, maybe the question itself is less important than what you do with it, whether you hold it gently or grip it tight, whether you let it keep you up or let it carry you to sleep. Kukding's blade never dulled because he stopped forcing it. Nietzsche's heaviest weight became weightless when he said yes. You don't have to say yes tonight, you don't have to say anything. Just let the thoughts sit there, wherever thoughts go when you're this close to sleep. It'll be there in the morning if you want it, and if you don't, that's fine too. Some questions are better as company than as puzzles to solve. Whether the thread was always unraveling on its own or you're the one pulling it, either way, here you are, listening, thinking about it, and maybe that's the part that matters more than the answer. Not whether your choices were free, but whether you can sit with them gently. The Stoics practiced that. Spinoza wrote his way toward it. Nietzsche tried to love it. None of them solved it, and that might be the most honest thing about this whole conversation. Some questions just keep you company. Let them. And if any of this gave you something quiet to turn over in your mind, we'll be here next time with more.